오늘도 이른 아침에 이렇게 많이 나와주실 때 대단히 감사합니다. 전례에 따라서 제가 영어로 얘기를 진행하도록 하겠습니다. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sure you all are aware of the fact that East Asian economies have been integrated rather rapidly during the last 20 years or so. However, that integration has been primarily market force driven rather than supported by institutional arrangements such as FTAs or any other financial arrangements. However, in recent years, particularly since the Asian financial crisis of 1996 and 97, there have been various institutionalization initiatives taken by East Asian countries for further accelerating the integration process. And some of those arrangements are made among themselves, I mean the countries in the East Asian region, and some of them are with the countries outside the region. For example, Korea-US FTA, which has been successfully concluded in terms of negotiation I think in last month was one example. So in this connection, various questions arise. What are the implications for all these initiatives for countries in the region? And also, what are the implications for the rest of the world and the countries outside the region? And what kind of strategies would countries would follow in response to these initiatives in East Asia? So there are many questions to arise. Well, this morning we're very fortunate to have a special guest speaker who will enlighten us in this regard, who is very well-known global consultant, global columnist. Many of you are familiar with his contributions in major journals, including Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, the Far Economic Review, and many other media. David Hale is the founder of Chicago-based Hale Advisors, and he advises and consulting many national corporations in North America, in Europe, and Australia and South Africa, and many countries in his as the founder of the Chicago-based Advisors. Mr. Hale was the global economist financial services group before he established his own firm. And actually, he is global, but he knows this region so well. Surprised, I'm sure he knows many individual companies, even kept us in this here, and he's making some money investing in foreign and cost as well. And so it's a pleasure to have David Hale with us this morning. He will, as I said, will concentrate his talk on most economic integration, and then I'm sure he will tell us a lot about the global economy in just a minute. This presentation will please join me for
very much. It's great to see old friends to learn about what's happening. I agree. My assignment is about the challenges in this region in terms of the process of economic integration, and also relationships with the larger world with the United States. And I guess the first point I'd make in opening is that right now by extraordinary imbalances, which are also the largest imbalance in the global economy is the U.S. foreign account deficit, so to $800 billion, a number of around 7% of GDP. Truly, very few economists 5 years ago or 10 years ago would have imagined possible any country in the U.S. could run such a large deficit. the reality is, the U.S. does not have a major problem in funding this very large deficit and attracting large inflows because of its relationship with East Asia. This region is also running large current account surpluses, which are helping to fund the deficit. The Japanese surplus is $150, $160 billion. The current non-Japanese East Asia is about $350 billion. So you have five areas right here in this region of current account surpluses, which have been offset the Americas. So had the last 2 years large surpluses in the oil-producing countries, right to current account surplus. The Persian Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, have a $1 billion surplus. So this also has created a new supply of excess global liquidity. That's global savings to help accommodate the American deficit. But there's no doubt that in the last 5 years, the most important player in achieving this global delivery has been East Asia. And we can see this in the data for East Asia's foreign exchange. Foreign exchange reserves in this region are now $3.2 trillion out of a global total $5 trillion. East Asia, including Japan and China, central players, now has 2/3 of global foreign exchange reserves. China is now $1.2 trillion. Japan is number 2 with about $900 billion. Then about $300 billion. Korea $250 billion. Singapore and Hong Kong $120 billion. These are truly very, very impressive numbers. The fact is, in general, depending on the country, anywhere from 60% to 90% of reserves in U.S. dollar securities, either government bonds or China reports to our Treasury about $400 billion of holding securities. The head of China's Foreign Exchange Reserve Department told me last week the country's over half of its reserves in bank liabilities. So on top of these holdings of governments, there's also very large holdings of bank CDs and bank securities. So these are impressive numbers, and again, they help to put in perspective how America has made this very, very large current account deficit. And a lot of the big issues in the world financial right now center on what will happen in the next 2 or 3 years. The Asian foreign exchange reserves and how Asian countries will in the future recycle their surpluses. And there have been some innovations in recent times because of these large surpluses. Great 2 years ago, a new investment company to manage $1 billion in foreign exchange in a more aggressive way, not just to buy government securities, but to invest in the stock market, possibly invest in real estate or commodities. I met with the corporation yesterday. 40% of this fund, like years ago, is now 60% is in debt. And at some point, you might do more with commodities. It hasn't gone that far yet. China announced last month they made a $2 investment company to diversify their reserves. This entity hasn't been created yet, because it's by the end of the year, and it will have a very, very important mandate to invest like money. The model for this, of course, is Singapore. Singapore created a government investment corporation almost years ago to manage its foreign exchange reserves in a more aggressive way. Well, GIC is now a major player in global financial markets. It's active in equity markets, it's in venture capital. It uses a large number of external managers, as well as having internal managers to run them. Norway also created, back in 1990, a petroleum investment fund. The Norway reserves given that country a huge financial surplus. Now it's worth over $250 billion. And this country invests this money in global equity markets and global debt markets. Until recently, it's worth having 60% debt. Now they're about to go 50-50 for the asset mix. Examples of how Asia will, in the next few years, be trying to manage foreign exchange progressively. Will this be a threat to the U.S. dollar? We don't know yet. Probably won't be. Because if they do invest in equities, they'll still be buyers of American paper. Because the U.S. stock market is still the world's largest stock market. It's got a capitalization of $1 trillion, which makes it equal to almost half of all global stock market capitalization. It's hard to have a diversification into equities without also buying U.S. dollars. So we may lose a little bit on the margin, but I don't think it'll be a huge capital outflow that will jeopardize this relationship we've had recently with East Asia. I think the current will be sustained for at least a few more years. But the fact is, the U.S. markets aren't yet saturated with foreign money. If we decompose where foreigners have money, it's spread over various asset classes. Foreigners right now have $2.5 trillion in the United States. That's manufacturing investment, plant factories, not mobile. Foreigners also own about 17% of the U.S. equity market. That's about $1 billion. They own about 25% of the corporate bond market, $2 trillion more. The only place where foreigners dominate is in the treasury market. Foreigners own about 45% of the treasury market because of these large central bank foreign exchange reserves. These foreign reserves are heavily invested in foreign securities. The fact is, the U.S. still has 30 trillion liquid securities in the stock markets, in the bond markets, in the government debt market, which are still, there are still plenty of securities that can be sold to foreign investors in the future to help the U.S. current account deficit. So my own conclusion is we stay this equilibrium, large American current account deficit, for at least a few more years. Now, against the backdrop of this current account deficit, there have been, over the last 5 and 6 years, some major changes in American policy, as well as in the trade policy of this whole region, which will have important implications in the future. 10 years ago, East Asia had no bilateral trade agreements. All East Asia had GATT framework, the global agreement on tariffs and trade that was created in the 1940s and evolved then in the 1990s with the World Trade Organization. There were no bilateral trade agreements in this region. Since that time, several dozen have been created. The U.S. has signed FTAs with Australia, with Singapore, and just completed one last week with Korea. Has FTAs with Australia, with the United States, now with India. Australia has done FTAs with America, with Thailand, is now negotiating one with China. And China is now proposing as well the creation of an East Asian regional free trade zone. They proposed on the Prime Minister's Conference 4 and 5 years ago. It's been underway now for some time. The hope is to have this in place by 2010. As a consequence of the East Asian financial crisis, we also began 5 and 6 years ago new experiments in regional financial cooperation. We had a meeting of key leaders several years ago at Chiang Mai, Thailand, and this set the stage for a whole new for policy cooperation. We now have regular meetings in the region of finance ministers and central bank governors. There's now a lot of study groups tied to this Chiang Mai financial regulation. And the countries in the region have created about $48 billion of currency swaps in the event that there is a new financial crisis. At the time of the East Asian crisis 10 years ago, the Vice Minister of Finance in Tokyo, Mr. Yasuki Sakakibara, proposed the creation of a regional IMF, an East Asian IMF. The Americans rejected the idea, the Chinese failed to support it, it very quickly died. But it would be fair to say that 10 years later, as a consequence of this change in the region, a lot of the key elements of what would be involved in having an IMF. We haven't created the actual organization. We don't have a secretariat like the IMF. But we have, through these currency swaps and this policy deliberation process, the potential for much more cooperation, much more interaction than would have been the case 10 years ago when the great financial crisis developed this region. So this is, I think, a very important development, and it has quite important implications as we go on. The other very important development since the East Asian crisis 10 years ago, in terms of this region, has been the creation of a vertical specialization process in China. Over the last 10 years, there has been a significant growth of intra-regional trade in the East Asian region. But if we decompose it, we will see the dominant driving force in this process of regional trade expansion has been the shipment of intermediate goods from Korea, Taiwan, Japan, ASEAN to China, where China turns these components into finished goods for export to North America and to Western Europe. Here are the numbers. This is the component share of exports to major countries in the region. The world economy, 20% of foreign trade is components. For Japan, it's 27%. For Korea, it's 26%. For Taiwan, it's 40%. For Malaysia, 20%. For Singapore, it's 48%. Philippines, 65%. Thailand, 27%. China's the lowest, just 16%. So we have a whole new process here of economic integration in the region, in which this region supplies China with components produced to finished goods. The consequence of this has been that China has a huge trade surplus with America, $260 billion, a big trade surplus with Europe, but runs trade deficits with all the countries in this region. A massive deficit with Taiwan, 55 billion, 30 or 40 billion with Korea, 20 billion with ASEAN, and so on. And if we decompose the trade again, we'll see that what this means is that a lot of this intra-regional trade, in the end, is focused on markets outside the region. In the official data, you now have intra-regional trade almost as large as your trade with Europe, North America, and Japan. But if you decompose it in terms of end markets, where the goods actually go, the fact is Europe, the US, and Japan still take 61% of the region's exports. China takes just 6.5%. So this huge growth of intra-regional trade is very much a part of this Chinese economic takeoff. And the Chinese economic takeoff has, of course, been quite extraordinary. China's exports will this year exceed $1 trillion. By 2008, China will probably be the world's largest exporting nation, larger than both the United States and Germany, which have been for many years nip and tuck in terms of which one is the world's leading export nation. And this whole Chinese export boom has had very powerful spillover effects on all the countries in the region, including Korea. The new risk, though, is that China may over time become more self-sufficient in producing these components and these parts. And if they do, then that will, of course, be a lost export opportunity for Korea, for Taiwan, for ASEAN, and the other countries in the region. We don't yet know how far this process will go. We don't yet know how far China changed this process of vertical specialization. But there's no doubt it has been a major feature of trade flows in this region now for the last several years. So, as a consequence of this trade process, this integration process with China, there's no doubt the U.S. economy now looks as a major risk, as a major challenge for this region in the next few years. And I see America creating two major risks for the region. The first centers on the U.S. business cycle. The second centers on U.S. politics and the danger of U.S. protectionism. Let's examine both of those risks. First, the business cycle. There's no doubt we've had over the last year a major slowdown in the American economy. The growth rate of the U.S. economy is 4% plus over a year ago to 2 to 2.5% recently. The major factor pressing the economy has been housing. After a great housing boom in the first 5 and 6 years of this decade, there has now been a major decline in home building activity, and we're seeing for the first time in 60 or 70 years declines in house prices. And this will persist for a while, because we have had in recent months a major crisis develop in our so-called subprime mortgage market, the mortgage market for low-income and poor people. And as a consequence of this credit quality crisis, banks will now greatly curtail credit access to lower-income Americans. So we're going to have several more months of housing starts and weak house prices. And this has, over the last year, knocked over a point and a half off the U.S. growth rate. The new risk in the American economy that's developed in months is capital spending. We've now had 2 quarters in a row of quite weak capital spending. And this has come as a big surprise to American economists, because last year, the American profit share of GDP rose to a 50-year high. Corporate balance sheets are more liquid now than they've been in 40 years. When your corporate sector is highly profitable and has great liquidity, you expect them to spend aggressively on capital goods, on new investment. But they haven't been doing that because of the housing downturn, because of concern about rising gasoline prices. Corporate managements in the second half of last year turned very cautious, and they began to reduce their growth. Instead of buying capital goods, they've devoted their resources to buying back their stock. Last year, American corporations spent $600 billion on share repurchases. They did that because we now incentivize our managements with stock option programs to want to promote a higher share price. And the result of these option programs has been to fundamentally change how corporate managements behave and how they think. We now have, among our corporate managements, an extraordinary obsession with share prices. And so they're using their capital not to invest in new capital goods, but to repurchase their stock. This is a fundamental change in U.S. corporate behavior. And it has, over the last 6 months, contributed to the economy. So, the U.S. will be a weak economy here in 2007, with a growth rate probably just a little bit above 2%. Will it slow down in recession? I don't think it will, because the Federal Reserve Board has not been as restrictive in this business cycle as it was in previous business cycles. Our inflation rate's gone up over the last 2 years, from 1.5% to 2.5%, but it hasn't gone to levels that require the Federal Reserve Board to push interest rates to lofty levels we would have seen 10 or 15 years ago. Interest rates 7 years ago was 6.5%. Peak in interest rates 10 years ago was, or I should say 15 years ago, was about 9%. Peak in interest rates 25 years ago was 20%. We're still at 5.25%. 5.25% has dampened the economy, has slowed housing, but it has not created the kind of severe credit shock with a kind of severe restraint that would set the stage for a full-scale recession. It still looks like we'll have a soft landing. But this will be a source of growth deceleration for the global economy. One of the big questions is, can other countries decouple from America? We don't know yet. Because the American downturn so far has been so concentrated in housing, it hasn't yet had major effects on American demand for consumer goods produced in East Asia. The weakness in capital goods has not yet shown up in the trade account. So we don't yet know about whether we'll see a decline in American imports of capital goods over the next few quarters. But the odds are there'll be some reduction in capital goods because of the slowdown we can see right in our own domestic spending. But so far, the impact of the American downturn hasn't been that severe in East Asia because it's been so concentrated on home building, so concentrated on residential construction. But as we move through the rest of this year, there will be some at least modest negative spillover effects. China will be vulnerable because China still depends first and foremost on America as an export market. America takes about 25% of China's exports. Exports to America are equal to about 10% of China's GDP. So if the American economy remains weak through the rest of this year, China's export growth is going to slow. China's export growth in the first quarter was still growing at rates of close to 30%, where it was much of last year. The American downturn is not yet visible in China's trade accounts. And if this downturn does persist for 2 or 3 more quarters, it will probably start to show up in China's trade account sometime this summer or this autumn. So it will be a cyclical challenge for Asia here in 2007. The second great concern I have about the U.S. and this region centers on the issue of trade policy. We had in America, 5 months ago, midterm elections for the American Congress. And the Democratic Party regained control of both the House and Senate for the first time since 1994. And this political change does pose a risk for U.S. trade policy because the Democrats have become, in years, very protectionist, very opposed to new free trade agreements, very opposed to the Doha Global Trade Round, very opposed to the process that we broadly refer to as globalization. We elected 28 new members of the House of the Democratic Party. Of those 28, 26 are very protectionist. We elected 6 new Democratic senators. Several of those men were also very protectionist. The most protectionist is Sherwood Brown from Ohio. He wrote a book 2 years ago opposing globalization. He would advocate going back to the kind of tariffs we had in the 1930s. He is a radical advocate of highly restrictive trade policy. So, there's a risk now that the American Congress will fail to support new free trade agreements or the completion of the Doha Global Trade Round. Let's examine how the negotiations are going right now on Capitol Hill. Rather than simply saying they'll reject new trade agreements, the Democrats are saying what they want to do instead is to have these trade agreements be amended to provide more protection for workers in foreign countries. They want to insist that any developing country in FTA agree to sign the 9 treaties of the International Labour Organization, which govern labor relations in various ways. The problem with this demand of the Democrats is the United States itself has signed only 2 of the treaties. And many American states have labor laws that contradict these treaties. In the American South, for example, we have something called the right to work law. That allows workers to remain outside trade unions. American corporations are allowed to break strikes by hiring non-union workers. In 20 states, there's a law that requires that a person leaving jail get a job as a condition for parole. We require that the exit from jail involves somebody seeking employment. These laws, these policies, do contradict these global treaties. So it creates the question, how can the U.S. insist that other countries sign these treaties if we don't sign them ourselves? And the White House is concerned that if we now impose this demand and insert all this labor legislation and treaties, that other countries will be able to sue the U.S. on the grounds that we ourselves are not in conformance, in convergence with these treaties. then you'd be able to sue the state of Georgia, the state of Alabama, because they allow this right to work law, which allows workers to avoid joining trade unions. So there's a lot of tension over this issue. And when I left America a couple days ago, the issue had not yet been fully resolved. Negotiations were still going on behind the scenes between the Congress and the White House and the Republican Party in the Congress, because the Republican Party in the Congress is very, very concerned about protecting state labor laws. In June, President Bush's fast-track trade negotiating authority will expire. And unless he reaches trade authority, there's no way we can complete the Doha Global Trade Agreement, because you cannot submit trade legislation in the U.S. Congress and get anything done unless the President has fast-track trade negotiating authority. Some Democrats, like Senator Baucus, have said we should extend the President's authority to try and give the Doha trade round a chance of succeeding. But because the negotiations themselves aren't going very well, because there has been now for many months an impasse between America and Europe and India and Brazil on issues involving agricultural trade, it's going to be hard to rally the Democrats in the Congress over the next few months to give this President new fast-track trade negotiating authority. So the Doha round is now also very much at risk. This is going to be a difficult environment in general for trade policy. What does this mean for Korea? Well, Korea's trade agreement has three major problems in the U.S. Congress. The three major issues are, first and foremost, beef, secondly, automobiles, thirdly, rice. Beef is a big issue because Senator Baucus of Montana is the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. Any trade bill has to go through his committee, and he has said publicly he will not support the legislation for the FTA unless his beef farmers in Montana have access to the Korean market. Now the hope is there'll be a verdict by a group with a French name, OEI, that controls global beef trade in the next few weeks, that will give Korea cover to basically allow improved and better access for American beef. If that comes to pass, Senator Baucus will support the FTA. The auto issue centers on the fact that Ford and Chrysler are very frightened of Korea. General Motors invested in Daewoo in this country several years ago when Daewoo went bankrupt, and therefore GM is very silent on the treaty, not critical of it. But Ford and Chrysler allege that Korea has many non-tariff barriers to trade in automobiles, and that this market cannot be penetrated, and therefore it's unfair to improve Hyundai's access to the American market. Right now, Hyundai produces in America half the cars they sell there. The other half are imported from this country. Because Hyundai's done well in recent years, they're talking about building a new American plant. If they do, they might be totally self-sufficient, not have to import cars at all. But right now, half their car sales are imported. And both Ford and Chrysler are claiming that there's no way the FTA can produce a true level playing field. So they will not be supporting the FTA with Korea. And the problem is, this will have an influence on members of Congress from Michigan. And there are some powerful members of Congress from Michigan with the Democratic majority. The third issue is rice, and the ranking Republican on the Trade Subcommittee, the Ways and Means Committee, comes from a district down south that produces rice. And therefore, he'll be lobbying for better access in the Korean market to U.S. rice exports. Because we don't have a huge rice industry, I'm not sure this will be all that big a problem. But there's no doubt the beef issue and the auto issue will be important, and they can get in the way. As I just mentioned, the Democrats will also demand that any FTA with Korea include these new labor amendments to guarantee protection for Korean workers. Now, because this country has very strong trade unions, we have a long history here of restrictive work practices, labor protection. So I doubt there'll be major problems for Korea with these ILO conventions. But you'll have to study them very carefully to see if there are going to be any conflicts with Korean law. Because the Democrats will probably insist, in some capacity, that the FTA also have these amendments on labor market regulation. So this is going to be, for Korea, a difficult 3 or 4 months. I think the chances of enactment of the treaty are still reasonably good, but nothing is guaranteed. because we do have these tensions, do have these disagreements on various microeconomic issues. And unfortunately, on trade policy, microeconomic issues are always very, very important, because members of Congress are very much affected by what's happening in their district, what's happening in their constituency. Now, the major focus of the Democratic protectionists is not Korea, it's China. And there are now, circulating in the U.S. Congress, a couple of dozen bills designed to basically reduce trade with China, to impose more barriers to Chinese imports, countervailing duties, anti-dumping duties, just in general, maybe to have higher tariffs. There was a bill introduced a year and a half ago by Senator Schumer of New York to impose a 28% tariff on Chinese imports unless that country had a significant revaluation of its currency. Hank Paulson persuaded him back in October to withdraw that bill. But because of America's growing trade deficit with China, the Democrats are talking about bringing that bill back sometime this summer. So this China issue is going to be, in the year ahead, a major, major test of congressional policy on trade. And let's look at what China will probably have to do in response. As I mentioned a minute ago, China now has a huge trade surplus. It'll be within 18 months the world's largest exporting nation, and it has $1.2 trillion of foreign exchange reserves. Those reserves increased by $140 billion during the first quarter. They increased by $1 million every minute during the first quarter. And they'll probably expand in the year ahead by a further $100 billion or more. And they could be, by 2005, $1.5, $1.6 trillion. These are truly awesome numbers. And they create a challenge for Chinese monetary policy, because China has to sterilize all these reserves, or they will contribute to faster growth of the money supply, credit, and could ultimately prove to be inflationary. And indeed, China's already issued over the last few years $650 billion of sterilization bonds to try and neutralize the impact of this huge growth in reserves. So China now has domestic pressure on its government to do something about the large trade surplus and about the rapid growth in foreign exchange reserves. This issue of the trade surplus is not just a global issue, not just an American issue. It also has domestic consequences for China's economy. And there are basically three ways China can try and respond to this challenge. One, the most obvious response, would be to allow the exchange rate to appreciate much more than it has. China began to float its exchange rate in July of last year, July of 2005. Since that time, it's gone up 6.5% against the US dollar. I was at the Central Bank of China in October, and they told me their plan for the next 5 years was to revalue the currency by 4 to 5% every year until 2012, to revalue by 25% over 5 years. A slow motion, gradual response to this huge trade surplus. But my own guess is now there'll be pressure on China to allow the exchange rate to appreciate more rapidly. Not by 5% this year, but maybe 7 or 8%. Because of both the impact of the huge trade surplus on their reserves and also these trade tensions with the United States. The second possible response is to try and recycle the money by encouraging large capital outflows. And capital outflows from China are increasing now. Chinese firms are engaging in more foreign direct investment. They're also, for the first time in their history, buying foreign companies. Last year, for example, Lenovo, a computer company, bought the personal computer division of IBM. The Chinese oil company, CNOOC, made a takeover bid last year for an American oil company, Unicap. That deal would have been worth $18 billion. It was vetoed by the U.S. Congress. But it was a sign that China is now embarked on a big global search for oil reserves. So while China can't do deals in America for political reasons, they can do them elsewhere. And they've announced plans in the last year to invest $5 billion in Nigeria, to invest $1 billion in a new nickel mine in Papua New Guinea, to invest billions of dollars in infrastructure projects in Brazil and Argentina to facilitate trade with China. So China is going to be, in the next few years, a bigger exporter of capital via FDI. China introduced a policy last year of allowing $18 billion of portfolio investment by its domestic insurance companies and domestic fund management firms. But so far they haven't taken advantage of it. The banks, for example, have a $14.5 billion quota, but in the last year they've only exported about $500 billion of capital. They've been reluctant to go overseas because of concern about their appreciating currency, reducing returns on foreign assets. But the fact is, last year, other foreign currencies did outperform the RMB. The Korean won in the last year and a half has gone up 15%, compared to 6% of the Chinese RMB. The European currency has been strong. The British pound has been strong. The Australian dollar has been strong. Chinese institutions could have found asset classes last year outside China that would have outperformed their own domestic currency. So in time, we'll probably see also more diversification into foreign markets by Chinese financial intermediaries. And the final policy response to this challenge of managing the foreign exchange reserves is to tighten up your domestic monetary policy. And they've been doing that steadily over the last year by increasing reserve requirements. Over the last year, they've taken the reserve requirements of the banking system from 6% up to 12%. They've raised reserve requirements several times. And the goal, again, is to reduce the impact of this surplus liquidity, this excess liquidity on the domestic financial markets, domestic money and credit growth. So these are the possible responses that China can have to this challenge of managing this huge growth in foreign exchange reserves in a large trade surplus. And my own conclusion is they'll probably in the year ahead do all of these things. The exchange rate will appreciate by more, not 5%, but 6 or 8%. They will keep trying to tighten monetary policy through reserve requirement changes, and they will try and do more to encourage capital outflows, both for direct investment projects as well as through various kinds of portfolio capital allocations. This won't fully solve the problem, but it will be an important series of steps designed to try and contain the impact of these large trade surpluses in rapidly growing foreign exchange reserves on China's economy. What about other players in the region? The other most important country in the region is, of course, Japan. And Japan now has a currency, the yen, trading at a 20-year low on a trade-weighted basis. The yen has been a very weak currency in recent years because Japan still has a very low interest rate monetary policy. Japanese money market yields are only 50 basis points. A year ago, they were 0. Japan has had this zero interest rate policy for 6 years to combat deflation. The Bank of Japan decided this time last year that deflation was coming to an end, so it began to move in a more restrictive direction. This time last year, it reduced the surplus liquidity in the banking system, and in July, it raised interest rates to 25 basis points for the first time in 6 years. I saw Mr. Fukui, the Japanese central bank governor in Tokyo 6 months ago. He told me his goal before he leaves office is to raise Japanese interest rates to 1.5%, to get there by March of 2008. But now, because we've had data recently showing weakness in consumer spending and persistent deflation, he's off schedule. He's not been able to raise interest rates as quickly as he wanted. And my guess is that by the time his term ends next year, we'll be lucky if we get even to 1%. There may be room for only 1 or 2 more Japanese monetary interest rate hikes in the year ahead. There will probably not be 4 more. There'll also be in Japan this summer a midterm election for the upper house of the Japanese Diet. And this is an election where Mr. Abe right now is suffering in the opinion polls. Because he isn't doing well in the polls, his government's been lobbying Mr. Fukui to go slow on monetary tightening. And now his cabinet secretary is making threats to Mr. Fukui about the succession next year in the Bank of Japan. Up until a few months ago, it was widely assumed the new governor of the Bank of Japan in March of next year would be Mr. Muto, the current deputy governor who joined the bank in 1983 after spending many years as a very high level of Ministry of Finance. But now Mr. Shiozaki is promoting 2 other candidates. Mr. Takanaka was the economics minister a year and a half ago, and Mr. Ito, a professor at Tokyo University, who's a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. Both Mr. Ito and Mr. Takanaka have been opposed to Japanese monetary tightening on the grounds the country is still suffering from deflation. they want a very go-slow policy in terms of monetary tightening. So what this means is that Japanese interest rates are going to remain low for quite some time. And these very low interest rates have had a very major impact on Japan's capital account. First, over the last couple of years, they've encouraged huge capital outflows by Japanese retail investors looking for higher yields in other countries. Japanese retail investors over the last 2 years have exported over $160 billion of capital into bond markets in New Zealand, the United States, Australia, Europe, looking for higher yields. And for a country like New Zealand, this has become a very dominant factor in the financing of their current account deficit. They sell something called Uridashi bonds to Japanese retail investors, and they very much dominate the New Zealand capital account. And they have in recent months pushed the New Zealand dollar to a 25-year high, 74 cents US, just last week. So this has had a very major impact on other countries' markets. We've also developed something called the yen carry trade. The yen carry trade is a process by which global hedge funds and other investment institutions borrow in yen to invest in other countries' asset markets. There's no way we can quantify precisely how big the yen carry trade is. I've seen estimates as low as $50 billion. I've seen estimates as high as $1 trillion. The BOJ has told me in private conversation they think it's at least $100 billion. But the reality is we don't collect data from hedge funds to keep track of this phenomenon. All we can do is engage in guesswork. But we know it's a factor. Whenever you see market correction that causes people to become risk averse, it causes the hedge funds to reduce their yen liabilities. When they do that, there's an immediate rally in the yen. We saw this back in late February. It was a Chinese stock market crash. Shanghai market fell 10% in one day. This produced a wave of corrections all over the world for the next 2 or 3 days. New York fell. Tokyo fell. Europe fell. Australia fell. And as the hedge funds reduced their leverage, the yen rallied 3 and 4%. Then, a few days later, the market stabilized, began to improve. Hedge funds once again began to borrow, began to speculate, and the yen weakened again. So we have this phenomenon of the yen carry trade, which has played a major role in depressing the value of the Japanese yen. Now, this low value of the yen is also becoming a trade issue in America. Members of Congress from Michigan are very alarmed about the growth of Toyota and the decline of General Motors. And so they're introducing trade bills saying we should punish Japan for having a weak yen to try and protect Ford and GM and Chrysler. I don't believe this legislation will be enacted. I think Hank Paulson will be successful in persuading the Congress that we cannot control China's or Japan's currency policy. That Japan's currency is weak for market-related reasons, not intervention. And it's weak because Japan has to have this very accommodative monetary policy to fight inflation. But the fact that we have this legislation in the Congress, the fact that bills have been introduced to punish Japan, is again a sign of how the environment has changed. How the congressional Democrats are more aggressive, more protectionist, and will, if given an opportunity, try and find ways to strike back at Asian countries that they perceive are engaging in unfair trade practices, and in particular by having undervalued exchange rates. And there's no doubt that with both Japan and China, there are complaints now, and have been complaints for some time, that they have undervalued currencies, and that these undervalued currencies are a tool for conquering global markets. American members of Congress have no sense of China's monetary history. They don't realize that back in 1997-98, China helped stabilize East Asia by not devaluing its currency. They have no understanding that China adopted the dollar exchange rate target in 1994 as a way to have a stable pillar for its monetary policy. There's just a remarkable ignorance of how this whole process has developed over the last 10 or 12 years. The focus is not on Chinese history, not on Chinese monetary policy evolution. The focus is very much on one thing, that very, very large U.S. trade deficit and the fact that it might represent the loss of jobs in American manufacturing industry. So the bottom line is that we are right now at a somewhat dangerous time. We've got a weak U.S. business cycle, which will dampen growth in the world economy in the year ahead. Not dramatically, but on the margin. And we have a U.S. Congress which is very much now tilted in a protectionist direction. And the White House, the President, and his team have got to find some way to work with the Democrats to try and save these free trade agreements. And not just Korea's in play. We also signed FTAs last year with Colombia, with Peru, and with Panama. And we're now trying to also get these bills through Congress. Democrats are demanding that all of these bills have these new labor amendments. And we don't yet know if there'll be a compromise on the labor issue to save these bills. So we have right now before the Congress 4 FTAs. And if we go out a year, we've also had negotiations that could have led to more FTAs. We've had in the last 2 years negotiations about FTAs with Malaysia, with Thailand, with South Africa. Right now there are no bills. We haven't reached agreements. And if we don't make any progress on the current FTAs, Korea and Latin American FTAs, then these other ones will simply die. And I think if the Democrats do strangle U.S. trade policy, if they do kill the FTAs, this will be a major blow to America's ability to play a leadership role in East Asia. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, we now have a tremendous amount of innovation going on right now in trade policy in this region. Lots of new bilateral FTAs among Asian countries, as well as Asian countries with Europe, with Latin American countries like Chile, potentially with the U.S. and Canada. If the U.S. cannot offer Asian countries the possibility of FTA agreements as a way to enhance its economic relationship with those countries, it will be very much passive leadership baton to China. It will very much, I think, strengthen China's ability to play a dominant role over the next 10 or 15 years in shaping this region's trade policy. So it's not just Korea which is at risk right now, or even Peru or Colombia or Panama. It's the whole ability of the United States to play a constructive leadership role in driving the larger issues that set and determine global trade policy. So we do face some major challenges, we do face some major risks. I'm hopeful that reasonable people, the Democratic leadership, people like Charles Rangel of New York, Senator Baucus of Montana, will be able to find a compromise and carry their backbenchers with them in enacting these new FTA agreements. But as of today, there are no guarantees. There's a great deal which is now in play. There's a great deal which is now at risk. And all we can do is watch very carefully over the next 3 or 4 months to see how the Congress resolves these issues. As I want to stress again, what's at stake is not just Korea. It's the whole ability of the U.S. to play a major and important leadership role in setting global trade policy over the next 5 or 10 years. Why don't I stop there, and we can take any questions you would have on these points or any others. I'll stand right here. Okay.
Thank you very much for very, very comprehensive but detailed coverage of not only East Asian economies, but the U.S. economy and the U.S. politics and every details. And I'm sure you heard all the statistics and you know how much statistics he has in his brain. So with this, I'm sure you have many questions or comments regarding what he said or he didn't say. Any questions? Yes, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Day. How do you foresee in China, especially monetary policy related, as they have done already 7 times, 8 times raising within 1 year? Yes. For reserve requirement rate, and 3 times raised interest rate. But every economist anticipate there will be more frequent interest rate arrangement. How do you foresee about the frequency and the range of interest rate raising, and what would be the impact, or what is the byproducts or bottleneck for raising interest rate? Thank you.
Well, the interest rate policy process in China is very different than it is in the United States or Korea. The central bank carries out monetary policy, but it doesn't make decisions about monetary policy. Key decisions are made by the State Council under the influence of the Prime Minister or even President. So it's a very different policy process than you have in this country or in the United States or in Britain or most other industrial countries. The central bank is not independent. Now, there is a broad perception right now that the Chinese economy is growing too rapidly. The recent growth rate here in the first quarter was almost 11%. The government target, the various forecasts made by government officials, are talking about a growth rate of 8%. And there have been several attempts over the last year to bring in administrative controls on capital spending, because China's had here in the last couple of years one of the greatest capital spending booms in human history. The investment share of GDP last year was 48%. At the peak of the Korean boom in the 1990s, it was 41%. So 48% is truly an awesome number. What's even more awesome is the fact they have this kind of capital spending and are running a huge current account surplus. They're able to do this because their domestic savings rate is also around 50%. When you had the capital spending boom in the 1990s, you were running at least a moderate current account deficit. So, the conclusion of most economists in Beijing and Hong Kong who follow China is they will raise interest rates this year at least 1 or 2 more times. But because nominal GDP growth is 14% and interest rates were only around 6%, it's doubtful we'll have a truly restrictive monetary policy. It'll dampen things on the margin, but it will not be highly restrictive. It may, on the margin, dampen some of the recent real estate boom in the big cities. It might, on the margin, dampen the Shanghai stock market, which over the last 12 months has gone up by 150%. In the 6 weeks since that correction we had in late February, the Shanghai market's up a further 30%. So it's truly a robust bull market. Indeed, 1 million people a week now in China are opening new brokerage accounts to trade the market. So we have elements now developing of a bubble. And I'm sure the authorities would like to try and rein it in. Indeed, in recent weeks, many government officials have said publicly they're concerned the stock market is really a bubble and really going too far, too quickly, and that something should be done to try and slow it down. So there'll be a bias towards restraint. But Chinese interest rates will not get so high as to fundamentally dampen the business cycle. Whatever they do will be on the margin. And because of the concern about the excess liquidity coming out of foreign exchange reserves, they will, I think, continue to raise reserve requirements until they feel they've got this problem under control. But because reserves increased by $140 billion in the first quarter alone, it's not clear how far they'll have to go. They'll just keep tightening until they get to a level where they feel they've got things under control. And right now, because the reserves are growing so rapidly, they don't feel they have things fully under control. So they've got a challenge. And there will be further monetary tightening. And there may also be more administrative actions to try and rein in capital spending. A year ago, they made the governor of Inner Mongolia sign a confession that he had too many capital spending programs. That was quite unusual. The tradition in China is that local officials compete to have a high rate of economic growth to get promotions for other jobs. This was the first time a local official was severely criticized for being too aggressive in promoting economic growth. We have the Party Congress coming up in October. Many people now are trying to have capital spending projects, high rates of economic growth to get ready for the Party Congress. They want a promotion as China lays the groundwork for big leadership change in 2012. Perhaps once the Party Congress is over, there'll be some slowdown in this capital spending. We'll also have the Olympics next year. Once the Olympics are over, there'll be a big decline in construction activity in Beijing. Right now, Beijing is going through $40 billion of new capital spending programs to get ready for the Olympics. But a year from now, that will be all over. And that will surely slow the economy, at least, of Beijing. So China will, at some point, over the next 12 or 18 months, slow down. And it will be a combination of monetary tightening, administrative action on capital spending, and of course the U.S. economic slowdown. The old rule of thumb a year ago was every 1% decline in U.S. GDP growth will weaken Chinese export growth by 8%. Hasn't happened. Year-on-year growth rate in the first quarter was still almost 30%. But sometime, by this summer or this autumn, this U.S. downturn might begin to finally bring down the growth rate of Chinese exports from 30% to maybe around 20%. And if they do, that will help to slow the economy because exports now in China are 36% of GDP, a very big number.
Okay, good. Yes, Mr. Lee, and then Dr. Han.
Thank you very much for your comprehensive and insightful analysis of Asian and world economy. And I would like to raise one question to you, that is resource diplomacy of China. It seems to me that one of the most important factors which will decide the future of Asian as well as global economy will be how to get energy, oil, natural resources. And China's policy has been criticized for being too aggressive and mercantilistic. And the United States and China seem to be facing each other almost everywhere in the world.
Yeah.
How do you expect the future strategy of China?
That's a very good question. I've actually written over the last year some quite significant articles on China's role in the global commodity markets, because I do think this now looms as a major geopolitical challenge, not just economic challenge. First point they'll let me make is that we did in 2003 and 2004 pass what I think is a great landmark in world economic history since the British Industrial Revolution. In 2003 and 2004, China, for the first time ever in the 20th century, overtook the United States to be the world's dominant consumer of most industrial raw materials. China's share of global copper consumption is now 22%. The U.S. is 16%. For nickel, China is 12%, the U.S. is 10%. For steel and iron ore, China is off the charts. China's steel production is now 450 million tons. That's more than twice as large as the U.S. and Japan combined. So China now dominates global seaborne iron ore trade. In 2004, China also displaced Japan to become the world's second largest oil consumer. Its oil consumption is now about 7.5 million barrels a day. And because its domestic output's only 3 million barrels, it's now emerged as a major oil importer. And therefore, it's now embarked upon a great global search for natural resources, for oil and for metals both. If we look at the oil sector, there have been many big deals done. They made a loan for $2 billion 2 years ago to the Angolan government to get oil leases. They announced a year and a half ago $2.5 billion investment in Nigerian offshore oil fields. President Hu Jintao went to Lagos last April to announce $2.5 billion of Chinese infrastructure investment in China. China is also investing in the oil sector in Indonesia. 2 years ago, they bought on the Canadian Stock Exchange a company called Petro Kazakhstan for $4.5 billion. And 6 months ago, they bought a second Kazakhstan company on the Canadian Stock Exchange for $2 billion. They've announced in recent months a plan to invest in Venezuela. Most foreign oil companies now are leaving Venezuela because of President Chavez nationalizing everything. But Chavez wants to be an ally of China, so he'll let the Chinese come in and invest as the American and British and European companies pull out. So there's no doubt China is going to be, going forward, a major player in all the natural resource sectors. It's going to be a major investor in a major market. And this will continue indefinitely because China is going to have, in the next 20 or 30 years, a huge increase in its automobile population, which will generate tremendous demand for gasoline. Let me give you a few numbers on this. Goldman Sachs, the big New York investment bank, produced a report last year on the world automobile population of the 21st century. The numbers are truly awesome. In 2005, the American people had 140 million cars. The Chinese people had 15 million cars. The Indian people had 5 million cars. In 2050, Goldman Sachs estimates, the Americans will have 280 million cars. The Chinese will have 500 million cars. The Indians will have 600 million cars. If you believe those numbers, the price of oil is going to increase 5 or 6 times, which means China will force us by 2020 to abandon gasoline, to abandon oil, and to go to fuel cells or some new technology, because we simply won't produce enough oil on this planet to accommodate this kind of car population. The best experts I know on oil think that we have the potential over the next 10 or 12 years to increase global output from 83 million barrels to maybe 93 million barrels, with new fields in Kazakhstan, West Africa, Russia, Saudi Arabia. But to accommodate this kind of car population in China and India, we'd have to go to 140 million barrels. We're not going to be able to do that with current levels of technology and known oil reserves. So this is going to be a major, major challenge looking out 20 years. And the only solution we have is technology. We will have to replace the traditional internal combustion engine with something built on hydrogen and fuel cells, because we just can't accommodate this kind of car population.
Indeed, very, very comprehensive coverage of global affairs, and I'm very much enlightened. Basically, I have one comment and one question. 20 years ago, U.S. experienced a terrible trade imbalance against Japan, and you had gone through Plaza Agreement to appreciate Japanese yen almost 50% within a matter of less than 3 years, right? But that major exchange rate realignment had not resolved a chronic U.S. trade deficit. I suspect that similar things might happen, despite your recommendation to appreciate Chinese renminbi so rapidly. And I would like to hear your view on this. Unless regaining the competitiveness of U.S. manufacturing, I don't think this exchange rate realignment resolved here global imbalance as you predicted. Well, okay, that's one question.
Yeah.
And the other comment is that on the U.S.-Korea FTA, I would like to recognize that this is the largest cross-Pacific FTA.
Right.
And far greater than you deal with this Colombia or Peru, Panama, so forth. So it has very significant implication for the U.S. to engage the ongoing East Asian regionalism.
Right. So
in that context, I think this Korean government is ready to re-import beef.
Right.
But with respect to automobiles, I think this U.S. cars not really popular here in Korea, despite whatever actions we take.
I've been told you don't have enough room to park American cars.
Yes, so I would like to ask you how we can convince the U.S. Congress or senators from Michigan. Korean government actually needs to work on this passage of the FTA for Korean National Assembly as well as U.S. Congress. What sort of the policy recommendation you would like to make for Korean government to convince U.S. lawmakers? Thank you.
Well, I think on the first question, there's no doubt that exchange rate movements do not fundamentally affect current account imbalances unless they also have an impact on domestic savings and investment balance. Because the current account imbalance represents a gap, a deficit between savings and investment. And the real reason America has a big current account deficit is that it has a negative household savings rate as well as a government budget deficit. There is a positive savings rate in the corporate sector because of high levels of profits, but the household sector, for the first time now in our history, is itself in deficit. So the combination of these two phenomena, government deficits and a household deficit, has given us this very large current account deficit. And the exchange rate by itself cannot solve the problem. But there is a perception that an exchange rate change can, over time, on the margin, have some impact on competitiveness, and therefore allow the U.S. to enjoy more export-led growth, as well as to encourage some import substitution. And indeed, because the dollar has been weak over the last 3 years against the European currency, plus other currencies like Australia and Canada, the U.S. has enjoyed in recent months almost double-digit growth in exports. So there is a perception that this devaluation has had a benign effect on U.S. trade with some regions. On your second question, this issue of the automobiles, there's no simple answer. My guess is the ultimate answer will be for Hyundai to build a new factory and produce even more cars in the U.S., maybe importing components, but having final assembly in America. And if that happens, that will mean that there'll be new congressmen with this plant in their district who will support Hyundai. You can already see in Congress some members who have plants from Toyota, Honda, being more pro-Japanese. The fact is, the foreign firms now employ tens of thousands of Americans, but they're not in Michigan. They're in Tennessee, they're in South Carolina, they're in Alabama, Mississippi, they're in Texas. They're not in Michigan. Michigan, because of its high level of trade union domination, has not been able to attract foreign companies. Ontario is a player in this too. Last year, Ontario produced more cars than Michigan. Because Canada has a national health care program, its labor is less expensive than admission, where we have private health insurance, and the automobile companies have huge private sector health liabilities. And Ontario is also very concerned about competing with Korea. Ontario companies have told me they're very, very concerned that they will also find it difficult to access the Korean market, either for automobiles or for auto parts. So you've got general fear in North America that this market here is not open, that there are non-tariff trade barriers, and they'll just keep making this allegation. And there's no easy way to resolve these complaints. They're just simply going to be a fact of life. But Hyundai, I think, by its investment program in North America, might be able to go partway in addressing the concern. The other thing you might do is simply create a quota to buy 25,000 cars from Ford or something. Just have a quota and find some way to use those cars here in Korea. I think right now the sales of the U.S. car companies here are less than 10,000. They're very, very tiny. And maybe if you gave some guarantee that you could use the cars for something, that might also go partway to appeasing these concerns. The problem is Ford made a bid for Daewoo back in 2001 when it was bankrupt. Ford made a bid higher than GM. But after it looked at the books, Ford dropped out. Then GM came in and bought Daewoo for a very low price. So GM is potentially your ally. You may have to use General Motors to explain to the U.S. Congress that the market here is not really closed. And these corporate lobbies are very important. Let me say that China has the benefit in Washington of corporate lobbies. China has something that Japan never had. In our trade tensions with Japan 10 or 15 years ago, there was no corporate lobby in Washington for Japan because there was no American FDI in Japan after World War II. The Japanese basically banned FDI. They did not want it. China, by contrast, has been totally open to FDI. China now has over $700 billion of FDI. And many U.S. companies are very successful in China. GM has 12% of the car market in China. Eastman Kodak has half of the camera market. Procter & Gamble has a large share of the soap market. We've got some very powerful corporate lobbies in Washington saying, please don't pick on the Chinese. We like them. And that is a big, big asset for China in these debates over trade policy. You must do the same thing. You must seek out here in the American corporate community the firms that are doing well, like General Motors and others, and have them help to lobby you with members of Congress. Because these lobbyists do know how to talk to congressmen. They can talk about how there's trade from their district with Korea, how they're creating jobs in their district because there are opportunities in the Korean marketplace. And this is just the way politics is done. You've got to have a local constituency to help you. And China has now very, very powerful corporate lobbies taking its side. The National Association of Manufacturers is deeply divided. They've got 15,000 members. The top 300 members do not want protectionist policies against China because they're active in China and are doing very well. The 5,000 smallest members in Michigan, Ohio, Minnesota, Illinois are protectionist because they don't have the resources to invest in China. They haven't got any salespeople to go to China. They're totally domestic. They're afraid of Chinese competition. So they're defensive, not aggressive. They're protective, not proactive. And this is a great dividing line in U.S. business. But the reality is the big, big lobbying groups, the big, big companies have taken China's side because U.S. business in China has been highly successful in the last 5 years in carving out large market shares and enjoying very high rates of return. And General Motors, I can tell you now, makes more money in China than it makes in the U.S. It makes a difference.
Thank you very much. I think, yeah. Well, I think we can go on like this for all day, and still we cannot exhaust all the questions and comments. I'm sure we learned a lot of things from David Hale this morning. But the last point I would like to underscore is the FDI. I think the Chinese economy as a whole obtained more than $62 billion of FDI last year alone. But in Korea last year, unfortunately, FDI reduced. And I think the policymakers and the general public as a whole should give much attention to this very, very critical aspect. And as David just said, the big difference between Japan and China is this FDI. And unless we take advantage of this FDI and the globalization, I think we'll lose out. And so the establishing business-friendly environment is the key to attract FDIs. Well, I think we have to end here, and David Hale is scheduled to have interviews with major Korean newspapers this minute after this meeting, and he's scheduled to go to Japan and China for other engagements. I'm sure we'll have another opportunity to have David back to us and talk more about the global economy. With this, we have to end. Please join me in thanking David.